China is an enormous country. It has 1.4 billion people, and China has been the largest economy on Earth since 2016 when you measure its GDP at purchasing power parity. In fact, I would argue that the economic rise of China is one of the most important developments in the past 80 years since the end of World War II. The fact of the matter is you simply cannot understand the world we live in today without understanding the rise of China and how it has changed everything. This is why I decided to come to China to see it with my own eyes. And the following presentation that I made explaining China's economic model is based on more than 2 years of research living in China and trying to understand China's very unique system, which is known as socialism with Chinese characteristics and a socialist market economy. So if you've ever wondered how exactly China's system works, I hope I can help to explain that today. Before I talk about what exactly is socialism with Chinese characteristics, I want to briefly talk about China's development model because it's important to understand how China has economically developed in a remarkable way in the past several decades. Now, if you go back to the early 19th century, before what's known as the Century of Humiliation, which began with the First Opium War in 1839 when the British Empire attacked China and partially colonized parts of China, and then other colonial powers, including Japan and other Western countries, also attacked China and colonized part of China. Back in the early 19th century, China represented roughly 1/3 of global GDP. This is according to the data compiled by the renowned economic historian Angus Maddison. And what essentially we've seen in the past several decades is China's returning to this position that it previously had before European and Japanese colonialism. And, if you look more recently in 2025, China is now the largest economy on Earth. It represents nearly 20% of world GDP when you measure its GDP at purchasing power parity. Of course, gross domestic product measures the value of all the goods and services produced in a country in a given year. Later, I'll talk about some of the limitations of GDP. It doesn't take into account inequality and the kinds of economic production. Certainly, there are issues with GDP, but just to understand the size of China and how monumental the shift is in the global economy, we see that the US was the world's largest economy, especially after World War II destroyed most of the other major economies in the world. But China has been the number one economy since 2016. And the US share of the global economy has been falling over time. It's now less than 15%. What's even more incredible, again, I'll talk about the issues with GDP later, but just to understand the level of economic development in China, not in terms of distribution and inequality, but the level of development in China. If you look at GDP per capita, per head, accounting for the size of the population, and you also adjust for the purchasing power of the currency of different countries, you can see that as recently as 1980, China's GDP per capita was lower than that of Haiti, Honduras, India, the Philippines, and Sudan. And today it's several times higher. I mean, this is an absolutely remarkable example of economic development, which is why I would say that the economic rise of China is one of the most important political developments in the past 80 years since the end of World War II. Now, again, I mentioned that GDP does not factor in inequality. I'll talk about inequality later, but in terms of poverty reduction, we've heard a lot from, mainstream neoclassical economists talking about global poverty reduction in the past several decades. What they often conveniently leave out is the fact that according to the World Bank, 3/4 of global reduction in extreme poverty in the past 4.5 decades have been because of China. And China has completely eliminated extreme poverty. Now, if you adjust for the difference in living costs in countries, and you look at the share of the population living on less than $4.2 a day, obviously that's very low, but this is the poverty line set by the World Bank. You can see that in China, no people in China now live on less than $4.20 per day, whereas still in India, nearly 1/4 of the population is at that level, similar to the level of Honduras. And in Nigeria, for instance, the most populous country in Africa, still over 60% of the population is living on less than $4.20 a day. If you raise that poverty threshold, this is not the extreme poverty, the absolute, this is relative poverty threshold. If you raise it a bit higher to $10 a day, again, adjusting for living costs, still around 1/4 of people in China are at this level, which is roughly the same level as Brazil. But that's significantly lower than the global average. And it's much lower than other neighboring countries in Southeast Asia, like the Philippines, for example, where over 80% of the population lives on less than $10 a day. And even India, we've heard a lot in the Western media about India's economic development, largely because India is, it's not aligned politically, but it has good relations with the US, or at least until Donald Trump. But, India has made some strides in economic progress, but it's very much exaggerated. And still around 90% of the Indian population lives on less than $10 a day. And what's interesting is this is the same figure of less than $10 a day, but you can divide the rural population and the urban population. So in China, overall, around 1/4 of the population lives on less than $10 a day. And of course, the living costs in China are much lower than that of the US. With $10 a day in China, I mean, you can get 3 meals a day, unlike in the US where you could probably get 1. But anyway, the point is that when you look at the urban Chinese population, obviously incomes are higher than the rural population. This is a big issue that the Chinese government is dealing with today, which I'll talk about later in the presentation. Extreme poverty has been eliminated, especially in rural areas, but there's still this gap, this divide between the urban and the rural population. Although even the rural population in China still lives in better conditions than the world average. Now, if you look at median income, this is, of course, very important because if you're a person, you want to know what your actual income is. The median income in China has absolutely skyrocketed in the past few decades. In 1990, the median income was under $2 a day. Now it's about $13 a day. This is median again. This is not average. And what's also interesting is Vietnam. I'm not going to have time today to talk about Vietnam, but it has a very similar model to China. China's model is known as a socialist market economy. Vietnam's model is a socialist-oriented market economy. And Vietnam is the only other country that's made similar levels of progress in extremely rapid growth in median income, which is significantly higher than the global average. Now, in terms of life expectancy, China's life expectancy has more than doubled since the revolution in 1949. And what's incredible to keep in mind is, in 1931, Japan started to colonize Manchuria. And then in 1937, they started a full-on war, which was the beginning of what in China is known as the World Anti-Fascist War and the war against Japanese aggression. World War II for Europe began in 1939. In China, World War II began in 1937. And obviously, life expectancy fell quite a bit. And after the war ended, life expectancy rose a little bit. But then especially after the revolution in 1949, we've seen extremely rapid increase in life expectancy. And today, China's life expectancy is at basically the same level as the US. In fact, even during the pandemic, China's life expectancy was higher than the US because the US government had so few measures to protect its population. Now, at the time of the revolution, the life expectancy in China was 35 to 40 years. Now it's around 78, 79 years. In terms of child mortality rate, China's now at the same level as developed countries in the West that developed through colonialism, like the US, and also slavery, of course. The US developed through slavery. China's child mortality rate is significantly below the world average at the same level of developed countries. And in terms of maternal deaths, China and also Cuba and Vietnam have some of the lowest levels on Earth. Okay, so this gives you a very brief overall view of China's level of economic development in the past several decades. It's incredible. But now I want to talk more about the system in China and how China achieved this. It's important to establish what China achieved before we talk about how it achieved this. Now, of course, everyone knows Mao Zedong, the leader of the revolution in 1949. Another name that is somewhat well known in the West, but also often misunderstood, is Deng Xiaoping. And because today I'm specifically talking about socialism with Chinese characteristics, it's important to talk about Deng because he's the one who originated that term. He was the de facto leader of China starting in 1978. And that year, he initiated what's known in Chinese as the reform and opening up, 改革开放. And I mentioned that Deng is very misunderstood, and a lot of Western, China hands, observers, they portray Deng as someone who just abandoned socialism and adopted capitalism. And they often, for instance, use this quote that is misattributed to him, "To get rich is glorious," which really misunderstands what Deng's idea was. And not just Deng, because he was one political leader in the Communist Party, and there were other political figures who played an important role in the reform process that I'll talk about as well. But in reality, Deng's argument was not just, we should just get rich. The point was that by allowing the use of market forces naturally through uneven development, some parts of China would develop and become prosperous faster than other parts, which is, in every country in world history, this has happened. There's been a process of internal uneven development. However, Deng always emphasized that the advanced areas that develop later have the duty to help what he called the backward areas, the less developed areas in China. And this has actually become a major priority today. In fact, it's known as the central contradiction. And this has become part of the Common Prosperity Campaign, which I'll talk about later. But I mentioned that Deng Xiaoping is very misunderstood. And if you actually read what he was saying and writing at the time and the idea behind the reform and opening up, it was not to just completely abandon socialism and take the capitalist road. He recognized that China was still very poor and very underdeveloped and agricultural and did not have significant industrial manufacturing capabilities. So he emphasized that, quote, "The development of the productive forces is also a kind of revolution, a very important one. It is the most fundamental revolution from the viewpoint of historical development," end quote. So revolution is not just about class struggle, because if you're still dependent on exporting raw materials to the advanced capitalist countries and importing manufactured goods from the advanced capitalist countries, you're not actually breaking with this global inequality in the global value chain and in the global division of labor. You have to be able to challenge capitalism as a global system and not just internally. So Deng Xiaoping pointed out that in the past 3 decades, since the creation of the People's Republic in 1949, China had laid the basic socialist foundation in agriculture and industry and other strategic areas, but their productive forces developed much too slowly. They needed a revolution to remove the obstacles to the development of the productive forces, which is really advanced manufacturing. And he criticized the Gang of Four and the kind of ultra-left line in the Communist Party and said that basically they argued that it was better to be poor and underdeveloped and agricultural under socialism than to be rich under capitalism. But Deng was not arguing in defense of capitalism. He was saying that this ultra-leftist view that, fetishizes agriculture and a lack of industrial output, that is not socialism. He said, Marxists have always held that socialism is superior to capitalism, and socialist countries should be able to develop their productive forces more rapidly than capitalist countries. He says, if the economy remains stagnant and the people's living standards remain at a low level, we cannot say we are building socialism. So this explains the idea behind the development of socialism with Chinese characteristics, which was officially declared in 1982. And the Communist Party declared that, according to their analysis, China was still in the primary stage of socialism, and it needed to develop the productive forces before it could later on move to more advanced stages of socialism. And then in 1992, the subsequent president, Jiang Zemin, he declared officially, he adopted the term the socialist market economy to refer to China's economy. Now, what exactly does this mean? I'll talk more about the role of the market in China's economy, but China has a capitalist class. They have capitalists, but they don't form a class in the sense that they are a political force that can control the political system. Like in the US, I mean, it's so obvious. In the US, over 80% of candidates in the Senate with more funding win the election, and in the House of Representatives with more funding win the election. It's the best so-called democracy that money can buy. We see this very clearly with Donald Trump, who's inviting all these billionaires to his inauguration and having dinners with them. In China, there are capitalists, but in terms of as a consolidated class, they do not have political power and certainly not state power. And the state can control this capitalist class and discipline the class and use, in particular, state control over the financial sector and the money supply. China also has very strict capital controls, and basically discipline private industry and control its access to money and credit to force it to invest in strategic sectors that are planned by the government. And, unlike in the US, where if you're a billionaire, you can basically do whatever you want, including, buy the government. In China, I mean, you will face very severe consequences if you violate the law and go against national interests. Now, to understand why this reform was so necessary is if you look at China's industrial output, it was still at a very low level in terms of what it was actually producing and in terms of the share of the overall economy. In the 1970s, China was still a very agricultural society, with the majority of the country living in the countryside and working in agriculture. At the time of the beginning of the reform and opening up in 1978, only about 20% of China's population, less than 20%, was living in the city, which is actually a lower level of urbanization even compared to India, a country that still has a very large agricultural population today. Today in China, over 70% of the population now lives in urban areas. So, I mean, when you think about what China looks like today compared to 1978, I mean, it's a completely different world. 4/5 of people in China were living in the countryside, working primarily in agriculture and in the informal sector. Now, Deng Xiaoping may be somewhat well known, but even less well known than Deng is the second most powerful leader of the Communist Party in the late 70s and the 80s, and that was Chen Yun. And he was really the ideological architect. Deng Xiaoping was a political leader, and he was an ideologue. He had an ideological worldview, but actually Chen Yun was the kind of real mastermind behind the economic reforms. And Chen Yun famously articulated this idea of what he called the birdcage economy. So Chen famously said that the bird is the market forces, is private capital, and the cage is the overall economy established by the Communist Party and by the state. And they can shrink or expand the size of the cage. So when they need more market forces to develop certain industries, they can increase the size of the cage, allow more opportunities from private forces. But when that goes against national interests, and especially when there are things like inequality rising and pollution and other issues, they can shrink the size of the cage and discipline capital. But the point is that private capital is always the bird that is trapped in the cage. So let's look more specifically at what the role of the state and private forces are in the Chinese economy. This is from Thomas Piketty, the French economist. And if you look at the level of state ownership of assets in China at the time of the reform and opening up under Deng Xiaoping in 1978, 100% of the assets held by Chinese companies were state-owned. All the companies were state-owned. And what's interesting is, there's this idea that Deng Xiaoping just privatized everything and he was a capitalist. And that's completely absurd. So if you look when Deng Xiaoping was the de facto leader of China from 1978 until the end of the 1980s, you can see that when he stopped being leader of China, still around 90% of all of the assets of companies in China were state-owned. And I'll talk about the privatization under Jiang Zemin, but even despite that in the 90s with privatization, by 2006, the level of state ownership of assets in the overall Chinese economy has been very stable since 2006 at about 55% of the total capital of all companies in China. So about half of the assets of all companies in China are from state-owned enterprises. Those are concentrated in the strategic sectors of the Chinese economy. This is known as the commanding heights of the economy, right? So one, finance, probably the most important part of the economy. All of the major banks and financial institutions are state-owned, and they have a monopoly on the money supply and access to loans, which is very important. It's the lifeblood of any economy. So any private company that wants to invest needs to get that funding from the state-owned financial sector. But not just that. The telecommunication sector, the energy sector, transportation, some real estate some parts of the real estate sector, even some heavy manufacturing like steel production, and certain important key industries are all state-owned, and they're run by these massive state-owned enterprises. These are some of the largest companies on earth. And if you look at the share of the Fortune Global 500, these are the 500 largest companies on earth, you see that the majority of them from China are these massive state-owned enterprises. Now, I mentioned that in the 1990s, there was more privatization. At the beginning in 1990, about 90% of all of the capital of all Chinese companies was state-owned. And by the end of the 90s, it was about 70%. And then it fell a little bit more to 55%. This was under Jiang Zemin, who was the president after Deng Xiaoping. Well, Deng was never officially he was never the official leader. He was the de facto leader. But under Jiang Zemin and Zhu Rongji, who was the premier, they did oversee this privatization, but it was not just privatize everything and let the free market take control of everything. No, the slogan was grasp the big, let go of the small. The strategic industries remain state-owned in the commanding heights of the economy. However, at this time, China had a lot of fiscal issues, and it still was dealing with high rates of inflation. So in order to reduce deficits and to combat inflation, which is always a very serious economic issue that erodes the purchasing power of the working class, uncompetitive and unprofitable industries in non-strategic sectors were privatized. This includes, for instance, things like many hotels and restaurants were state-owned, but also factories, making things like TVs and consumer goods. So these are the non-strategic consumer goods. It's not things like steel production, right, that remained state-owned. And if you look at the overall level of all property in the entire economy in China, in 1978, the public property was about 70% of total property. And what's interesting is, this is also from Thomas Piketty, and what's interesting is if you look at the European so-called social democracies, you've seen that by the 2010s, in most European countries, there is basically no public property as a share of total property because of the level of debt. In fact, in the US, there's actually a negative share of public property because the public institutions, the very few that exist, are in debt to private financial interests that own their debt. So in China, it has remained at the highest level of all of the major economies in the world. And again, if you look at the state-owned enterprises, the SOEs, as a percentage of GDP, their assets as a percentage of GDP, you can see that as of 2018, about 200% of GDP was represented by the assets held by state-owned enterprises. Even if you look at, a social democracy like Norway, which has a massive state-owned oil sector, even in Norway, it comes nowhere close to the level of assets owned by state-owned enterprises in China. And certainly it's much lower in Korea, Italy, and India. And again, I mentioned, if you look at the Fortune 500 list of the 500 largest companies on earth, and you look at state-owned enterprises on the list, there are some other state-owned enterprises like Saudi Aramco, which is the major Saudi oil producing company. And you can see that if you look at all of the SOEs on the Fortune 500 list, the vast majority, 3/4, come from China's SOEs. Now, what's also interesting as part of this reform process is that there was a decentralization of political power. What's not that well known about China is there's this idea that the central government in Beijing just controls everything and forces all of the provincial governments to do what Beijing wants. That's not at all how the Chinese political system works. In terms of the economic decision-making power that provincial governments in China hold, it's extremely a decentralized system, and they have a lot of leeway in determining what local governments in China how their economies are going to work, what their planning will look like. And a big reason for that is because China has 1.4 billion people. It's a massive country. It's not realistic for Beijing to determine what all of the local economies will be doing. It makes no sense. It would be irrational. So what we've also seen actually is in the past few decades, the state-owned enterprises that are administered by the central government in Beijing, their share of overall ownership in the entire economy has fallen, as actually we've seen an increase in the share represented by state-owned enterprises owned by provincial governments and even also local city governments. So what we've also seen at the same time is that there are a lot of state-owned enterprises that are not 100% owned by the state, and there are different levels of state ownership. And in fact, over 80% of companies in China have some level of state ownership. So even if you have these big private tech companies, the state often owns at least part of those companies. A good example of this are the tech giants Alibaba and Tencent. They are private companies, like Alphabet, which owns Google, or Meta, which owns Facebook. But the difference in China is that even though they're not officially state-owned, because these are international companies, and we saw, the campaign against TikTok with all this propaganda against TikTok. So in order to promote internationalization, they're not fully state-owned, but instead, the Chinese government has what's known as a golden share, which means that the Chinese government has veto power over very important decisions made by these big tech companies, which is a way of preventing these tech companies from, going against the interests of China and the working class overall, and giving the state, significant power over these big tech billionaires. And if you don't do this, we see what happens in the US, where they just take over the government. And what's also interesting is there still are cooperatives. We'll talk about agricultural cooperatives in a second, but there also still are worker-owned companies in China. Now, obviously, they're not nearly at the same level as they were in the Mao era, especially in agriculture. But what's interesting is a lot of people don't know this. Huawei is actually probably the world's largest worker-owned company. And I mentioned that there are also agricultural cooperatives that have recently been increasing in size. And this is especially under President Xi Jinping when he was appointed the General Secretary of the Communist Party in 2012 and then president. He initiated a major anti-poverty campaign. Now, obviously, this was going on for years, but this was a significant priority of President Xi. And as part of this anti-poverty campaign, he prioritized the invigoration of agricultural cooperatives in rural areas. And also not just in agriculture, but in other areas. This report notes that there are more than 10,000 primary supply and marketing cooperatives that have been set up in the past few years. And, if you read the Western media, sometimes they freak out about this and say that Xi is bringing back the Mao era's policies but this is because the government recognized, and it's not just the central government in Beijing, but as part of this anti-poverty campaign, you had a lot of local governments and party officials who were working with local communities. And basically what would happen is local party officials would meet with representatives from the community and say, okay, what can we do to invest in infrastructure and job training and education? And what can we provide to you all to help provide job opportunities, to increase employment, to reduce poverty, to invigorate these local economies? Like, what can we do working together? And one of the ways that they did this was massively investing in these cooperatives. And if you are interested more in this, the Tricontinental Institute has a very good report detailing China's rural revitalization and anti-poverty campaign. Now, this is, of course, a controversial issue in the West, but even on the issue of democracy, this is something that's not that often discussed in China, in the West, about China. But what's interesting is that this Western organization called the Alliance of Democracies, which is funded by Western governments, and ironically, it's also funded by Taiwan. And it was founded by Anders Fogh Rasmussen, who was the Secretary General of NATO and the Prime Minister of Denmark. This is not in any way like a pro-China organization that's like controlled by the Communist Party or something. This is as Western as it gets. They do an annual study called the Democracy Perception Index, and they measure government approval around the world, and they've consistently found that China and Vietnam have some of the highest levels of government approval on earth. In fact, this study found that 83% of people in China consider their system to be democratic, and 77% of people in Vietnam, which is some of the highest levels on earth. And ironically, they found that many Western, capitalist democracies, so-called democracies, are actually not democratic. The majority of people in some Western countries say their system is not democratic. Now, some people look at this and they say this is crazy propaganda, even though, again, I need to stress, this is from a Western government-funded organization. This is their study. However, it makes a little more sense when you also look at how people in China and in general the global South understand democracy. Because when they're asked what they mean by democracy, they think of it in a very different way compared to North America and Western Europe. If you look, the vast majority of people in the global South, they understand democracy as a system of government in which the government acts in the interest of the people to improve living standards and well-being. Whereas in Western capitalist countries, their understanding of democracy is protecting individual rights and freedoms. So this also makes sense why, so many people, the vast majority of people in not only in China, but even in Vietnam and other socialist countries do consider their system to be democratic because they have a very different way of understanding how democracy works, because they've seen in a few generations how their living standards have absolutely skyrocketed and extreme poverty has been ended. So I talked about the birdcage economy and the reform and opening up and the level of private capital, the role of private capital in the Chinese economy. So now I'm going to talk about what China's foreign investment strategy was, because there's this idea that China just like allowed foreign companies to just do whatever they want and to exploit Chinese workers, and that's how they developed. But obviously that is way too simplistic. And the reality is that China always had a very clear strategy for foreign investment, because they recognized that if they just allowed foreign companies to invest in China, then they would just simply invest in sectors where they exploit low-paid Chinese workers, and that China would never actually develop the productive forces and move up the global value chain and move its way out of the lowest part of the global division of labor. So when China did allow foreign investment starting in 1978, the idea was that the foreign companies had to meet two conditions. The first is that foreign companies had to form joint ventures with local Chinese companies. These are known as JVs. So for instance, Volkswagen, the German auto giant, they would form a joint venture with a Chinese car company. The Chinese car company would own 51% and Volkswagen would own 49%. And also another condition was technology transfer. And Deng Xiaoping famously referred to this as technology transfer for market access. This was the slogan in Chinese, 市场换技术, which is very important to understand because this part has been misunderstood and misrepresented in the West. And we hear this constant propaganda, especially from hawks in the US, claiming that China stole intellectual property, in scare quote, and was stealing all of this from Western companies. But actually, if you look at the contract signed by many of these companies that invested in China, a condition of their investment is they had to agree to technology transfer because China did not want to simply stay at the bottom of the global value chain permanently, right? Because if you think about the global division of labor, and the level of manufacturing output and the kinds of how advanced technological manufacturing is in countries around the world. China, at the beginning of the reform, was at the bottom of this global pyramid, which you can think of as like the global division of labor, right? Where you have very low value added, very labor intensive industries with low profit margins, because they're all competing against each other. And China, this is what it looks like today, but China was at the bottom and it didn't have many capital intensive, higher value added industries, and certainly did not have any high tech industries. So Foreign direct investment, FDI, did play an important role, primarily for technology transfer, and especially in the 90s, right? However, there's this idea that still today, China's economy just simply relies on foreign, primarily Western companies just investing in China, and they just supposedly steal all their intellectual property. That is not at all what happens in China. And if that was ever true, it's obviously grossly exaggerated. If it were ever true, there were elements of truth in the 90s, although it wasn't forced technology transfer, it was voluntary. But yes, in the 90s, at the peak level, 6% of China's GDP was represented by foreign direct investment. But that figure has fallen very significantly, especially in the past decade. And today it's only around it's actually even lower than 1% of GDP. So China does not rely very much these days on technology transfer from the West, but that was a very important part of its development strategy in the 90s in particular. And I'll talk more about this issue of the global division of labor in a bit here. Now, as part of China's industrial policy, they didn't just want to have foreign companies invest and then permanently make, cheap toys and toasters and textiles for Western consumers. That's what the Western governments, in particular the US government, wanted. They wanted to keep China trapped at the bottom. The strategy of the West, the US in particular, was to keep China trapped at the bottom of the global value chain so Western companies can permanently exploit low-paid labor, and Western companies can design the goods and they'll have a monopoly on the intellectual property, and they make the vast majority of the profit, where only a very small percentage of the profit goes to China or other global South countries. That was what the West wanted, what these Western companies wanted when they were investing in China. But obviously, China did not want to stay at the bottom of the global division of labor. So the Chinese government had clear plans, targets made for its industrial policy. And still today, China, the Communist Party issues 5-year plans. And we're about to see the new 5-year plan. And the strategy was industrial upgrading, to move up this global value chain. And they set different stages in different eras, in different decades, right? So in Chinese, these are known as the Lao San Yang, the 3 old things. So in the 1970s, the goal was for every household in China to have a bike, a watch, and a sewing machine. This gives you an understanding of the level of poverty and underdevelopment in China at the time, right? In the Mao era, China had made a lot of accomplishments in terms of raising living standards and very basic living standards from like a level of just desperation and starvation, and literacy and basic education and basic industrialization and women's liberation. However, by the 70s, China's level of development was still extremely low, and it was still one of the poorest countries on earth because it had such a big population. By the 1980s, the new goal was for every household to have a refrigerator, a washing machine, and a color TV. By the 90s, the goal, and these are of course goods that are manufactured locally in China. So the goal is to have this local manufacturing. In the 90s, the goal was again to move up the value chain and for every household to have an air conditioner, a VCR, and a computer. Again, all manufactured locally. And today, they now have this idea of the Xin San Yang. So it's now the 3 new things in China. And those strategic sectors that are prioritized in the previous 5-year plan are electric vehicles, solar panels, and batteries. And this is a big reason why China has become a juggernaut in the global green energy industry and is making huge progress in moving away from fossil fuels and helping the world transition to renewable energy. And this is also part of this idea that the Communist Party has been promoting called the new quality productive forces. Because I mentioned previously that Deng Xiaoping emphasized that China had very low levels of technological capacity and manufacturing capacity, and they needed to develop the basic productive forces. But now the strategy is to develop the new quality productive forces at the highest level of industrial output and high-tech industries. So if you look, for instance, at green energy, China now is building twice as much wind and solar capacity as the rest of the world combined. It's just off the charts. If you look at solar and wind, I mean, it's just crazy looking at China compared to the EU and the US. If you look at electric vehicles, I mean, it just, there's no comparison to the level of output coming from China right now. And this was not just because of private market forces. This is because the government, the Communist Party, established a plan and said, we're going to prioritize this sector, and we'll use our control over the state-owned financial system to give cheap loans to industry and encourage domestic competition in order to increase efficiency and massively expand output of renewable energy to make it now solar is the cheapest form of energy on earth, solar power. And what we've seen is that China has become the world's manufacturing superpower. I mean, in terms of industrial policy, which refers to government policies in order to promote industrial manufacturing, China is just the most remarkable example in history. It's absolutely incredible, going from this agricultural society where the vast majority of the population was living in the countryside 40 years ago. And now it's the manufacturing superpower in the world, representing about 1/3 of global manufacturing output. And China's manufacturing output is now more than all of the top 10 advanced economies combined. And at the same time, of course, we've seen in the US the exact opposite has happened in the neoliberal era, where the US capitalist class recognized that they could make much more money, they could have significantly higher returns on investment in the financial sector and in general in high value added services, not in manufacturing. So the US capitalist class decided to stop investing in manufacturing and instead to financialize the US economy. Today, 21% of US GDP comes from the FIRE sector, finance, insurance, and real estate. This is according to US data, and some people say this is actually probably a conservative estimate. And if you look at sectors of the US economy, by far the largest sector of the US economy is the FIRE sector, finance, insurance, and real estate. The red line here used to be manufacturing. The US was the world's manufacturing superpower after World War II, in large part because World War II destroyed all of the other major manufacturers. But what we've seen is the deindustrialization of the US economy and the financialization of the US economy. And this is because the US capitalist class decided that it would be much more profitable for them to do that. They were following their own bottom line, their own economic interests, and the government encouraged that. The government abandoned industrial policy. The government had this idea that it doesn't matter if you make a chip, a potato chip, or a computer chip. It's all the same, because this is this neoliberal idea that as long as the number go up, it doesn't matter what the actual sector is and how strategic it is. So what we saw, for instance, for compensation for workers in the US, this is according to, again, US government data, compensation for workers in the non-financial sector has been stagnant since the 1970s. But in the financial sector, compensation more than doubled. And this is a report from the financial crisis. If you continue after the financial crisis, the compensation for the financial sector has only continued to skyrocket. So this is why you have so many people in the US who get a PhD in physics and chemistry and engineering. And what do? They go work on Wall Street. They become a quant. They don't actually help to develop the country. And certainly they don't help to make green energy, right? What we've seen in the US is a bubble economy in the neoliberal era with this financialization of the US economy, where it seems like, according to, neoclassical, neoliberal economists, number go up. Look, GDP growth has been supposedly high, although actually GDP growth in the US has been significantly lower in the neoliberal era than it was in the Keynesian era. But if you look at these bubbles, the US economy has just become a bubble economy that relies on continuing to inflate these massive bubbles. First, we saw the dot-com bubble in the late 90s popping in 2000. Then we saw the housing bubble that peaked in 2007, leading to the financial crisis. Now we're in an everything bubble. There's a massive bubble, again, in the housing sector, again, in the stock market. There's this massive bubble in private credit and private equity, which is popping as well. It's the everything bubble. This is what I was saying. The market capitalization of all publicly traded US companies are now 220% of GDP, the highest level ever. I mean, so people love to talk about US economic growth in the past several decades, but the vast majority of the benefits of that growth have accrued to a small handful of capitalists. China, because it has state control over the financial sector, China has been able to pop these bubbles. There was a bubble in the Chinese property market, and what happened? The Chinese government said, houses are for living in, not for speculation. And in 2020, the Chinese government passed the 3 red lines policy and restricted real estate developers' access to credit because credit is run by the state-owned financial system. And they popped the real estate bubble and they intentionally deleveraged the sector, which significantly reduced the cost of housing, especially in some of the bigger cities, which makes housing more affordable for young people, which is obviously a huge issue in countries around the world. And what's funny is the Western financial press portrays this as like an example of the Chinese economy being in crisis and China is going to collapse. But this was an intentional deleveraging, a popping of the bubble that was carried out by the Chinese government. Because the Chinese government has state control over the financial system, what did they do? The pink line here shows that before China intentionally popped the bubble, you saw that there was a significant growth in loans given by the state-owned financial sector to real estate development. So a real estate developer like Evergrande, this notorious real estate company, they would take these massive loans in order to finish building apartments that people had already bought, and then they would sell apartments that haven't even started, but they sold those apartments to property holders, to these people who think they're going to have an apartment. They haven't even started building it yet. I mean, this is basically a kind of Ponzi scheme. So the government said, no, we're not going to tolerate this anymore. And they the government starved these companies like Evergrande of credit. And where did that credit go instead? The state-owned financial system in China stopped giving credit or significantly reduced the credit it was giving to real estate development. And instead, they gave it to industrial manufacturing, especially the high-tech sector, electric vehicles, solar panels, these other, artificial intelligence. And this brings me to the issue of inequality, right? So China now has recognized that they have achieved a very high level of development, especially in manufacturing output, but now they have a big issue, which is inequality. So in the National Party Congress in 2017, the Communist Party officially changed what is called the central contradiction in Chinese society. And they now recognize that previously the central contradiction was the need to develop the productive forces and reverse what they called the backwardness of social production. However, today that is no longer the official position of the government. The position now is they need to rectify and reverse inequality and uneven development inside China, especially between urban and rural areas in China. This is the quote from the official English readout of the 19th CPC National Party Congress in 2017. This is what they wrote, quote, "The principal contradiction of the Chinese society has evolved. In the past, the contradiction was between the ever-growing material and cultural needs of the people and the backwardness of social production. Now, the principal contradiction is between unbalanced and inadequate development and the people's ever-growing needs for a better life. That includes increasing demands for fairness and justice, rule of law, security, eco-environment, balanced urban and rural development, and equitable income distribution," end quote. So this is now the official top priority of the CPC. So this can help us to understand kind of 3 eras in China. So you have the era of socialist construction under Mao, starting with the revolution from 49 until 78. Then you had the reform and opening up under Deng, Jiang, and Hu Jintao, which is from 78 until 2012. And officially, when Xi was appointed the Secretary General and the President, now they have officially declared what they call a new era of socialism with Chinese characteristics. And again, the priority of that new era is reducing inequality and common prosperity. 共同富裕, that's the term in Chinese. It's commonly used now. And this actually is a term that did go back to the Mao era. It was used in a different context in reference to public ownership. Now the term has been very much popularized, and it's associated with equity, with reducing inequality. This has become Literally, I'm not exaggerating. This is literally the number one goal now of the CPC, of the Chinese government. And we've actually seen some progress in China in terms of looking at the Gini coefficient. The Gini is a way to measure inequality in a society. One would be, so this is income inequality. You can also use the Gini for wealth inequality. A Gini coefficient of 1 would mean that one person owns all of the wealth in the country. 0 would mean that there's 100% equality. Everyone has exactly the same level of income or wealth. This is looking at income. And you can see that in 2010, the inequality in China peaked. And since 2010, it has been falling. And it's at now close to the level of Australia. And it's probably going to keep falling. Certainly, without a doubt, it's going to keep falling because this is now a significant priority of the Chinese government, is reducing inequality. Now, there's also this economist, Branko Milanovic, who's a very interesting economist and world expert on inequality. And he's the only economist I've seen who's actually pointed out that it's important to measure the difference between labor income and capital income, right? Because if you look at a country like, for instance, Mexico or Brazil, you see that these are countries where the rich part of the population, they're obviously very unequal, but the rich population gets a lot of its income from ownership of capital, from ownership of assets, not from actual work, not from labor. Whereas if you look at China, in fact, China does have a pretty high Gini coefficient in terms of inequality, but that is mostly from income inequality. It's from labor income, not from capital income. So it's not wealth inequality. It's not ownership of capital that is leading to a lot of that inequality compared to many global South countries. And the US also has a pretty high level of inequality in terms of labor, in terms of capital income as opposed to labor income. So a lot of rich people in the US get their wealth from ownership of capital and financial assets, certainly compared to China, much more so than compared to China. So I already talked about poverty reduction and how China has ended extreme poverty. And I looked also at the rural-urban divide, which is still an issue, right? There still are rural parts of China that are relatively very poor, not in terms of absolute poverty, in terms of extreme poverty, but relatively compared to the city. They're still very underdeveloped. But again, if you compare this to like India, the progress that China has made is absolutely incredible, and they continue to make progress on that. I talked about wage growth, right? There's this idea that China just has like extremely low wages and they just have people working in sweatshops. It's just not true. In fact, China's manufacturing wages are significantly higher than neighboring countries in Southeast Asia, like, Thailand, and certainly compared to India. Earlier I talked about median income in China and how it's risen over 10 times. Let's talk about unions briefly. I don't have a lot of time, but this is also something that's, a controversial issue in the West. Now, workers in every industry in China have the right to form a union. Now, there's no so-called independent union, although I think that term can also be pretty misleading because we know that, even in the West, a lot of unions are not really that independent. And we see that even some unions endorse Donald Trump. I mean, I'm, of course, very pro-union and very pro the idea of workers organizing, but like the idea that every union is a progressive union is not true. There have been reactionary unions. There have been racist unions, right? So, I mean, yes, in China, there are no independent unions that are independent from the Communist Party, but in fact, there's a very high level of unionization in China. All unions are part of what is the largest trade federation on earth, which is the All China Federation of Trade Unions, the ACFTU. And it has more than 300 million members. And China's urban working population is about 470 million. So, and there are 270 million rural workers. So about 2/3 of the urban workers in China are unionized. Most people in the rural population are in the informal sector. They're small landholders, they're small farmers. So they're not unionized because they don't work for like a company. But about 2/3 of urban workers are part of this union. Every company in China with at least 25 employees is legally obligated to allow workers to form what is known as an enterprise trade union that's affiliated with the ACFTU. And this also includes foreign-owned companies, by the way, which has been something that has angered a lot of foreign companies in China. And all companies with an ETU must pay, the company has to pay an amount equal to 2% of their employees' wages to that union. And if a company has fewer than 25 employees, they can form a union, but it's a weaker union. It's a basic level union. It's not as protected as these larger ETUs that are strongly backed by the Communist Party. So this is actually, it's been a funny issue. These days, Walmart, for instance, has lost its market share in China. But previously, Walmart famously had fights with the Chinese government because Walmart is notoriously extremely anti-union, and they refused to allow workers to unionize. And the Chinese government said, no, you have to allow workers to form a union. And they succeeded in that. Now, I mentioned again that, obviously, yes, we should be pro-union and pro-workers organizing, but this is why I think we should have a more nuanced understanding of this idea of independent unions in scare quotes, because we know that historically the US government has weaponized unions. Jacobin actually published a really good article about this called How the AFL-CIA Undermined Labor Movements Abroad. There was an article in 1967 in the New York Times talking about how the CIA was supporting these right-wing unions to support their political interests, to oppose socialist governments, and to support just right-wing governments and military dictatorships during the first Cold War. The US government funds the so-called Solidarity Center, which is linked to the National Endowment for Democracy, and they've supported right-wing CIA coups and military dictatorships. So again, of course, we should absolutely support, workers and the working class, but we also need to have a more nuanced understanding of the labor movement and how we should, of course, support a progressive left-wing labor movement, but not every single union is progressive. Another example of this is there's this group called China Labor Watch, which people think, first of all, it's not even in China, it's in New York City. And second of all, people often point to this to talk about, how workers in China are treated like slaves and all this. This is, again, funded by the US government through the CIA linked to National Endowment for Democracy. And recently, by the way, they complained that 90% of their funding was coming from the US government. And some of that was frozen, although actually it's been unfrozen by Marco Rubio. MAGA supporters falsely claim that Trump shut down USAID and the NED. It's not true. It was merged into the State Department, and now Marco Rubio is the de facto head of USAID, and Marco Rubio is using that NED money. And if you go to the NED website, they talk about how they're continuing to fund opposition groups in China and Venezuela and Cuba and Nicaragua and other countries targeted by the US for destabilization. A few other quick points here. In China, there are a lot of delivery workers, especially people from rural areas who are working in the informal sector. So they go into the city, and one of the jobs they can get is delivery. This has become a huge issue for workers in cities in basically every country on earth. In China, the government has forced these big tech companies to force delivery workers to have protections. This has been a huge issue, and the government has been, forcing these countries and disciplining them to give more rights and benefits. So, for instance, now they have mandatory rest breaks, they have mandatory rights protections, mandatory minimum wage that's guaranteed for these gig workers. So, obviously there still is a long way to go in terms of, these people are often working long hours. But I mean, at least the government has been taking action to give them more guaranteed rights. And I think this is going to become more of an issue in the future. Also, there's this idea that in China that people work 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. 6 days a week. That is illegal. The government has said very clearly this is illegal. There were some tech companies that were trying to do this. It was actually the private companies that were trying to force their workers to do this. And the government said no. So there's this constant fight. I mean, again, obviously it's not perfect. It's not a utopia at all. There are still a lot of issues. There's still these constant fights between labor and capital. This is one of the contradictions of a socialist market economy, right? The state is in charge. State-owned enterprises are the commanding heights of the economy. However, there still are these private companies, and they're still constantly fighting with their workers. And, these tech companies were trying to force their workers to work 12-hour days, 6 days a week. And the government said, no, this is illegal. You cannot do that. In fact, in terms of working hours, yes, people in China do work a lot, but actually, if you look at global data on working hours, certainly compared to some Western countries, especially European countries, Chinese workers definitely work more. But if you look at other countries in Asia, I would say that the average working hours in China are around the average. So, for instance, it's at a similar level of in India and pretty close to Indonesia as well. Certainly in some more advanced countries in Europe and even, in Japan and Russia, actually, the annual hours worked by average workers are lower. But again, I mean, this is something that I think, honestly, that I think they should definitely work on improving and try to reduce the working hours. It's around 48 hours a week. This is an issue they could definitely improve. But again, I just want to emphasize it's not like 60 or 70. Like this idea that everyone in China is just like a slave, it's just complete nonsense. Like people just make up so much nonsense about China. But earlier I talked about the global division of labor. And I would argue that one of the main goals of imperialism is to trap countries in the periphery of the world system, primarily in the global south, to trap them at the bottom end of the global division of labor, of this kind of global pyramid of the division of labor. And the US government has made this very clear. This was also under Biden, not just under Trump. Under Trump, it's very blatant, but even under Biden, the Commerce Secretary, Gina Raimondo, famously admitted the goal was to slow down China's rate of innovation. The CEO of Anthropic, one of the main US AI companies, which is backed by Amazon and Google, Dario Amodei, he wrote an article in the Wall Street Journal. He's lobbying the Trump administration to continue to put more chip restrictions on China, which also the Biden administration did. This is bipartisan. And in another article, he admitted that the goal of this is to live in a unipolar world dominated by the US and US tech companies, where only the US and its allies have access to the most high-tech models of artificial intelligence. And this would give, as he said, the US a commanding and long-lasting lead on the world stage. And he said export controls are needed to prevent us from living in a bipolar or multipolar world. This is a powerful Silicon Valley oligarch saying that they want to live in a unipolar world dominated by the US. I was actually surprised to see that even J.D. Vance, the vice president and, underling of the far-right billionaire oligarch Peter Thiel, J.D. Vance, he literally worked for Peter Thiel, this far-right, fascistic Silicon Valley billionaire. And at a venture capital conference in March, he said the quiet part loud. He admitted what a lot of left-wing critics of neoliberal globalization have been saying for decades, which is, this is what he said, quote, "The idea of globalization was that rich countries would move further up the value chain while poor countries made the simpler things. You would open an iPhone and it would say designed in Cupertino, California. The implication, of course, is that it would be manufactured in Shenzhen," end quote. So this is, again, admitting that the strategy when the U.S. normalized relations with China under Richard Nixon, and when the U.S. allowed China to join the World Trade Organization in 2001, the strategy was to permanently keep China trapped at the bottom of the global value chain, Chinese workers trapped at the bottom in the global division of labor, to mean that Chinese workers would make cheap toys and textiles and toasters for U.S. consumers. So U.S. corporations would design the product, and then cheap Chinese workers would manufacture the product. J.D. Vance admitted that. That was the goal of neoliberal globalization. However, China did not want to stay at the bottom of the global division of labor. Vietnam doesn't want to stay at the bottom of the global division of labor. And these governments have very clear planning to move up the value chain so their workers are not trapped at the bottom of the global division of labor. And this is why J.D. Vance complained, we assumed that other nations would always trail us in the value chain, but they also started catching up on the higher end, end quote. So I think this, honestly, today is one of the key contradictions driving the new Cold War on China. And I'm going to conclude with this. We've seen, for instance, that China has caught up, not just in making, household appliances and TVs and computers and phones, but even at the most high-tech level, including artificial intelligence. We now see that there are models like LLMs produced by DeepSeek and Qwen. Qwen is another one that's produced now. And also Kimi is another one produced And this is why that we've seen OpenAI, which is, partially owned by Microsoft, the billionaire Silicon Valley oligarch Sam Altman has been openly lobbying the Trump administration to ban Chinese open source LLMs, open source AI models, because the fact that one, these are Chinese is a challenge to US hegemony, but also they're open source. These Chinese companies are releasing them for anyone in the world to run locally for free, which is a major challenge to the monopolistic business model of Silicon Valley. Peter Thiel, who employed J.D. Vance, this far-right fascistic billionaire oligarch, who famously wrote that capitalism is more important than democracy, he also said that he proudly said capitalism is based on monopoly, and every corporation wants to build a monopoly. He said competition is for losers. And this is what we see right now in China. Anytime China has a competitor to these US big tech corporations, they ban it. Biden tried to ban TikTok, and Trump is trying to force TikTok's parent company, ByteDance, to sell it to, as he said, a group of very wealthy people, to these billionaire oligarchs like, from Oracle, for instance. So again, I don't have time to get into this, but the business model of Silicon Valley is monopoly. This is the Uber business model. Whereas in China, in the non-public sectors, in the private sectors, ironically, because China has the socialist market economy, yes, they still do have a lot of private companies, but the Chinese government forces them to have cutthroat competition, unlike the US model, which is based on, monopolies. That's the Silicon Valley model for big tech. In China, is the opposite. China says, okay, the Chinese government is going to invest in infrastructure for electric vehicles, in charging infrastructure, these charging stations, which are all over. If you go to a tier 1 city in China, Beijing, Shanghai, Shenzhen, all these cities, you'll see, in every corner, you'll see a charging station. They're everywhere. There are more charging stations than gas stations. And that's why in these big cities, you see, like in Shanghai now, over half of the cars on the road are electric vehicles. And the government forced all of the taxis and all of the public transportation, including all of the buses, to be electric vehicles. And then, in terms of consumer cars, the Chinese government says, okay, we're going to have over 100 companies just having cutthroat competition. They're all fighting each other. Many of these companies are losing money. Profit margins are laser thin. They're basically, these capitalists investing in this industry are basically not making any money. But what it's resulting in is very efficient cars, because they all have to compete with each other because they don't have monopolies. They have to make better cars for cheaper. So you can get like an 8,000 US dollars equivalent. You can get like the entry level BYD EV. And like, I've been in many of these EVs from many of these companies. And by the way, some of these companies are state owned. Like Chery, for instance, is a state-owned company, or Chang'an is a state-owned company. SAIC also. So you have these state-owned enterprises making EVs that are competing with private companies to make like the best possible cars. And also, like, China's banning NVIDIA's chips partially as like its anti-monopoly law. So like, China takes monopoly very seriously. So the irony is, like, we're told that China's socialist system, socialist market economy, socialism is evil, right? And like, socialism cannot innovate. Meanwhile, it's actually the US neoliberal capitalist system is based on monopoly. It's not based on competition. So, I mean, again, I don't have time to get into this in terms of the 5-year plan and like the fact that the Chinese government establishes certain industries and says, we're going to develop this industry and allow private companies, we'll give them resources to compete with each other to make the most efficient products in batteries, in electric vehicles, in wind and solar power. The Chinese government made a plan saying, we're going to develop what they call new energy vehicles. We're going to develop an electric vehicle industry from 2021 to 2035. The government provided the resources and the infrastructure, and they accomplished it. So like, this shows that you can combine a market economy with elements of private competition to encourage innovation, but also the government can make sure that they're circumscribed and that capital is disciplined in a way that benefits national interest and the interests of the people. And I think this is a major reason driving the new Cold War, because that's what we're in today. And this is why a lot of this is important. Even if you're not interested in ever like going to China or whatever, like if you're not really interested in China, you should care about this, because unfortunately in Washington, they've made the assessment that we are in a new Cold War. This is Cold War II, and China is targeted by Washington for destabilization. And I would argue that the big reason for this is that this is fundamentally a conflict between China's system and the US-led capitalist system. The US-led capitalist system can only survive based on monopoly and destroying all challengers to monopoly capital's control over the most advanced high-end manufacturing in the world system. China is a direct threat to that, which is a significant reason for the new Cold War. So with that said, I'll conclude, but I hope people got something out of that presentation today.